Welcome to Points of Interest, a video series brought to you by the Investor Protection Clinic at Osgoode Hall Law School and sponsored by the Law Foundation of Ontario. In this episode, we will identify general investment risks and the responsibilities your advisor has in managing your investments. We hope this will give you some tools to help you recognize whether your investments are being mishandled or if any losses you've suffered are simply a result of market forces and risk. Finally, we will discuss some examples from our case files at the clinic to better give you an idea of what investment mismanagement can look like in the real world.
Sometimes you may be disappointed by the returns in your portfolio, but that doesn't necessarily mean your funds are being mishandled. Poor returns can sometimes indicate mismanagement, but returns by themselves are not the full picture. We'll start by looking at the basics of investment risk and the different ways in which your investments may be impacted by market forces that are present when you invest in the stock market. When you invest your money in public stocks or other investments, there is a risk that you may lose some or all of the money that you've invested. Different investments carry different risk profiles. Riskier investments may promise higher than average returns, but the risk of losing your money is also increased. In assessing your portfolio to determine if your funds were mishandled, it's very important to assess the risk of the investments and determine if they match your risk tolerance as an investor. Your risk tolerance is best thought of as your appetite and ability to afford an investment loss. If you're a person who cannot tolerate or afford a lot of risk, but your financial advisor has constructed your portfolio in high-risk investments, it may be a sign of mismanagement. If the risk of your portfolio is well aligned with your risk tolerance and your investments have deteriorated in value, it may simply be market forces at play. We're now going to discuss some of the main risks you may face when investing in the market. The first type of risk is market risk. Market risk refers to the risk that is associated with broader economic developments. Changes in our economy can have profound impacts on your investments, and it is important to keep an eye on these changes to understand how they may impact your investments. The second type of risk is liquidity risk. Liquidity risk refers to the risk that you may not be able to sell an investment at the time or at the price point you want because there is no established market of buyers and sellers. For example, when purchasing shares in large publicly traded companies such as Bell Canada or Rogers, there are many buyers and sellers, so it's unlikely that you would face liquidity issues. However, shares in some small companies or private companies likely don't have large numbers of buyers and sellers, making it difficult to sell those shares. The third risk is concentration risk. Concentration risk arises when you have invested all or a significant portion of your money in similar investments. Finally, lending money carries a unique risk known as credit risk. This is the risk that you will not be paid back the money that you have lent to someone. This includes investments in bonds and loans made to a private corporation. When purchasing publicly traded bonds, you can evaluate credit risk by looking at the credit rating of that bond. Investing generally comes with a certain level of risk. Depending on the types of investments you make, that risk can either be low or high. Whatever it is, it's crucial that this level of risk matches your risk tolerance. You need to ask yourself, how much can you afford to lose? If you do suffer investment losses, look at the types of investments you own and determine if the risks we've discussed correspond to your investment appetite. If they don't, it may be a sign your funds were mismanaged. But remember, suffering an investment loss may be part of the natural market cycle and not a sign that your funds were mismanaged.
In this segment, we will highlight the duties owed to you by your financial advisor. For example, what kind of assistance and care should you expect from your advisor, and discuss situations that may suggest your advisor isn't carrying out his or her duties properly. The advisor's duties to you, as a client, may differ depending on the financial advisor you're working with, the financial institution he or she represents, and the type of business relationship you have agreed upon. That said, there are broad minimum obligations required by Canadian securities laws that should apply to most advisor-client relationships. The two pillars of the advisor's duty center around the obligations of Know Your Client, or KYC, and suitability. When it comes to the KYC requirement, financial advisors should take steps to get to know you well enough to make informed decisions about the types of investments you should own. At minimum, this includes understanding your financial needs and goals, determining the amount of risk you can afford, and assessing financial metrics such as your income and assets. A one-time discussion at your first meeting is not enough. Advisors are required to follow up with you regularly to make sure they have up-to-date information. If your advisor doesn't conduct an appropriate KYC, it may be a sign that he or she isn't complying with their duties. With all that said, you, as a client, should be comfortable to reach out to your advisor and inform them of any important changes in your life, such as plans for retirement, losing or moving jobs, or plans to buy a house. The next pillar of an advisor's responsibility relates to suitability. Suitability means that your advisor must ensure that any investments he or she recommends to you is appropriate for you, given what risk you can tolerate and what your financial needs and goals are. This is the kind of information that should be collected through your advisor's KYC assessment. Complying with the suitability requirement means that your advisor should have a good understanding of the types of investment products he or she is recommending to you. Suitability is all about matching your financial goals with appropriate financial investments. Always remember that your advisor has the ultimate responsibility of ensuring that your investments are appropriate for you, even if you are the one to suggest the course of action or the investment plan. You should always keep in mind that the specific duties of your advisor may vary, depending on the firm and the type of investment account. What we've discussed here is a general guideline for you to keep in mind. Consult your advisor and firm about this today. While we have outlined a number of duties that your advisor needs to comply with, it's important to understand that the advisor duties are not foolproof, and you as a client should feel confident to ask your advisor directly about how he or she must care for your investments. A common misconception is that your advisors are required to act in the best interest of their clients. This is called a fiduciary duty. You should know that, in Canada, financial advisors do not generally owe a fiduciary duty to their clients unless the advisor is managing the client's money and investments with full discretion. As the client, you should feel comfortable asking your advisor directly about the types of duties owed to you, whether they have to make decisions in your best interest, and if they are required to disclose to you any decisions that may have a conflict of interest. Also, if your advisor is proposing complicated investment products to you, don't be afraid to ask questions about the risks, features, costs, and fees about the product to make sure that your advisor is recommending something that is right for you.
We'd like to share a few examples of investment mismanagement that the clinic has encountered to give you an idea of what investment mismanagement might look like. In the first case, Mr. A had been a longtime client at one of the Big 5 banks and had trusted his financial advisor to manage his investments for him. Unfortunately, the financial advisor didn't place Mr. A in appropriate investments, didn't update his KYC forms for 10 years, and didn't diversify his portfolio. As a result, Mr. A lost a substantial amount of his investments. Mr. A's advisor did not change Mr. A's investment strategy to reflect Mr. A's big life changes, and as such put him in investments that were entirely unsuitable. In another case, Mr. C met with a representative of an investment firm who convinced Mr. C to invest over $50,000 in the shares of an exotic, private real estate venture. The advisor made many misrepresentations about what the investment would entail, and the risks of the investment were not properly explained to him. Additionally, the KYC forms relating to the investment were filled out by the advisor using false information about Mr. C. Throughout the life of the investment, the advisor continued to make false statements regarding the risks involved in the investment and made false promises regarding payouts. In other words, the investment was thoroughly unsuitable for someone like Mr. C, and the sale of the investment was based on fraudulent claims. While these cases aren't an exhaustive list of examples of investment misrepresentation, they do demonstrate some of the most common instances in which an investor's money has been mismanaged. If you think that your situation sounds similar to one of these cases, it may be worth it to investigate further by talking to a lawyer or going to a clinic. It's important to remember, however, that just because there may be similarities between your situation and these cases doesn't mean that your investments have been mismanaged. Each case of suspected mismanagement will need to be evaluated individually and on its merits. As we bring this episode to a close, here are the key points of interest from your advisor's responsibilities in identifying investment mismanagement. 1. The fact that most investments have risk means there is a chance you will suffer some investment losses at some point in your investment timeline. Just because that happens doesn't mean your advisor has done something wrong. 2. If you're trying to determine whether your advisor has done something wrong, think back to the basic duties like KYC and suitability. Have they taken the time to understand your financial goals and needs? Have they chosen investments that fit your risk tolerance? 3. To help you determine if mismanagement has occurred, consider the following factors. 1. The risks in your investment portfolio compared to your own risk tolerance. 2. How your risk tolerance has been documented within the KYC form. 3. Whether the investments and the KYC documentation continue to represent your risk tolerance as your life situation changes. For more information on how to report misconduct, see the Points of Interest episode Reporting a Wrongdoing and Seeking a Remedy.
The Investor Protection Clinic at Osgoode Hall Law School acts for investors who believe their investments have been mishandled and who cannot afford legal representation. The Investor Protection Clinic is the first clinic in Canada to offer free legal advice to retail investors. If you have any questions about the IPC's services, this episode, or any other episode in the Points of Interest series, please feel free to contact us.